It has been absolutely forever since I reacted to MrBallen, so today I'll be checking out the video Frightening Proof You Can Live a Past Life. Now, full disclosure, as someone who believes in the darkly spiritual, and who is a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, I'm very much looking forward to this, and in particular, I do really like when MrBallen talks about things that have spiritual or supernatural elements. But we'll find out if that's the case for this video. Now, when it comes to these things, despite my beliefs, I do maintain a certain skepticism, and I try and search for more worldly explanations, if possible. Because there are a lot of things that are out there that are just hoaxes or delusions or hallucinations, people's fear getting the better of them, so on and so forth. But at the same time, I do believe that there's much more than just this physical world that we see all around us. And I have had my own share of dark spiritual experiences. So, I'll be fair and honest as always. But before I jump in, like, comment, and subscribe. Follow me on socials, linked in the description below. Also in the description, you can check out my Patreon for VIP access, bonus content, and a special tier where you can make a request and guarantee a reaction to it right away. That's tier 4. So hop on Patreon if you want to, and check it out. Alright, MrBallen, Frightening Proof You Could Live a Past Life. That's an interesting title, and it's a very different title than what I've come to expect from his other videos. So, let's see what this is all about. Let's dive in.
There are certain stories that legitimately just seem too strange to be true, and today's story is definitely one of those. But if you get to the end of this video, you will see that a major American educational institution fact-checked this story really aggressively, and it held up. It really happened. So, go into today's very wild story with an open mind. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to read the like button a bedtime story, but badly mispronounce every fourth word. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications
I love
so
this
you don't
channel,
miss any of our weekly uploads.
Such a good storyteller.
Okay, let's get into today's story.
I got my beer for this, and I am ready. Beyond the Veil.
At the end of December in 1984, in a little village in northern India, a young woman named Sumitra had her first child with her husband. And right away, Sumitra fell in love with her little baby boy. She had always wanted a baby, and now that she had one, she carried him with her everywhere, strapped to her chest. And any time she had a free hand from cooking or housework, she would use it to pat his head or tickle his feet. Life was not easy for anyone in Sumitra's village, which was located just south of the Himalayan mountains along the Ganges River. Sumitra's village was very poor. People lived in mud huts with thatched roofs, they had no electricity, and basically no one had any formal education. As for Sumitra, her life was especially challenging even relative to her peers, because when she was very young, her mother died, and then her father had to go away all the time for work, and so she was left alone a lot and basically was raised by a cousin. And now, even though she was married, her husband also had to travel quite a bit for work. And so Sumitra, she lived with her husband's parents in their hut, but the reality is she wasn't nearly as close with them as she was with her own family, and her own family was nowhere nearby. And so Sumitra's life was really quite lonely, even as an adult. And so when Sumitra had her baby, it was like for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone, and she was excited about her life. She was happy that something was finally going the way she wanted it to. But then, one day in early 1985, everything changed. That day, Sumitra, with her son attached to her chest, was walking into town to get water from the well. And as she was walking along the dirt path, she suddenly came to a stop, very rigid, and she dropped her bucket on the ground. A couple of other villagers who were nearby heard the bucket fall. They turned and looked at Sumitra, who was standing there totally rigid. And so one of these villagers, who was very concerned, walked over to Sumitra and asked her what was going on. But Sumitra, she didn't say anything. She just stood there frozen. And this concerned villager looked down at Sumitra
epilepsy?
Sumitra's hands, and her fingers were bending back so hard it almost looked like they might break going in the other direction. And then this villager, before asking any more questions, looked up at Sumitra's face, and her eyes had rolled back into the back of her skull, and she had begun grinding her teeth so hard that it was making this loud cracking sound with every movement of her jaw side to side. And so this villager was totally terrified and backed up for a second, and right as they did, Sumitra's baby, who was still strapped to Sumitra's chest, began hysterically crying. And so the combination of Sumitra's baby crying and these other couple of villagers who were staring at Sumitra, who's standing there in this very grotesque pose, attracted the eyes of other nearby villagers.
Do you think it's something spiritual happening up to this moment, or do you think it's something medically explainable? Because I think it could go either way at this point. It could be some type of, seizure or fit, epilepsy, again, maybe something like that. Or it could be something, maybe demonic, and I do believe in that, for the record. For those who are new here who don't know, I am a strong believer in that. I've had personal experiences with that. So this could go either way. Let's see where it goes.
And soon there was a crowd of people just standing there looking at Sumitra, not sure what to do. And then, just as suddenly as Sumitra had fallen into this trance, it stopped. And Sumitra, she kind of shook her head, she fluttered her eyes, and she looked around, and then suddenly became aware that her son is hysterically crying, and also there's this crowd of people all around her. She has no idea why. And so, feeling really embarrassed, but again, not knowing what's going on, Sumitra quickly picked up her water bucket, she held her son and hustled out of the crowd of people and made her way into town where she would get water. When Sumitra came back from the well and was back near her hut, she didn't tell anyone about what had happened on the way to the well. Frankly,
dark
she couldn't
things always
really
happen by a
remember
well.
what happened. And so Sumitra told herself that whatever happened on the trail to the well, that trance she fell into, it had to be a one-time thing, likely brought on by stress and sleeplessness from having a new baby. But a few weeks later, it happened again, and this time the trance lasted quite a bit longer. Sumitra's father-in-law had walked into their kitchen and found Sumitra standing there totally rigid with her hands kind of bending backwards and her eyes rolled back in her skull, and he would tell her later on that he had shaken her and tried to wake her up, but he couldn't for almost 10 minutes, and then when she had snapped out of it, she had no memory and had no idea what happened. By May of 1985, so roughly 5 months after her first trance, Sumitra was falling into these bizarre spells nearly every day, and they were lasting hours at a time. And
I do believe also, for the record, I do believe in possession by spirits that can happen to people. But there's no telling that that's necessarily what this is. And I don't like to jump to things like that automatically. There could be a very material explanation for this, something very worldly, once again. There are tons of conditions of the brain that can make the body do weird things. It can make things like this happen. There's so much about the brain and its functions that we just still don't understand. So I don't know what this is yet, but I know I keep speculating. This is a very intriguing story, so let's just get back into it.
even more bizarre, lately, during Sumitra's trances, she would begin to speak, and the things she said were totally strange. Typically, she would bark out cries for help. She would say her head was being crushed and someone needed to help her. And then suddenly her voice would drop down to a whisper, and she would say, "All I can see is darkness." Sumitra's family would contact the local medicine man, who would come out and examine Sumitra, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. Besides her trances, there seemed to be absolutely nothing wrong with her. She was the picture of good health. And then on July 16th, 1985, so roughly 6 months into these trances, Sumitra would fall into another trance while she was cooking, and during this trance, she would speak. Except when she spoke, she was very calm, and she just said, "In 3 days, I'm going to die." By this point, Sumitra was terrified of whatever was happening to her, and she was totally exhausted, and so was her family. Sumitra had stopped caring for her son, who was now about 8 months old, because she was afraid that at any moment she could fall into a trance and accidentally hurt him. And so her mother-in-law had basically become the boy's mother, and also Sumitra's husband, who was the primary breadwinner for the family, was forced to stop traveling for work and just stay home. home and help out
Imagine
with
being a mother
Sumitra
and being
and
afraid
his
to hold
son.
your own kid.
Finally, on July 19th, 1985, so this was the day that in her trance, Sumitra had predicted she would die. On that day, Sumitra woke up and made a very conscious effort not to do anything that could potentially harm her. She didn't cook because she didn't want to be near flames. She didn't walk near anything with any sort of ledge she could fall off. She didn't even walk downstairs for the same reason.
See,
She
she's
also
thinking about
kept
it too
a
much,
very
though.
safe distance
She's
from her
overthinking
son
this.
in order to make sure he was safe. And by late afternoon that day, Sumitra was just fine and there was no sign that anything bad was going to happen to her, and so she and her family began to relax. As Sumitra's mother-in-law began making dinner, Sumitra decided to go outside and get some fresh air. And when she got out there, she saw one of her close friends across the road, and so she waved to her, and as her friend cheerfully began walking closer to Sumitra to say hello, Sumitra suddenly froze, her eyes went back in her skull, her hands became rigid, and she fell into one of her trances. And so this friend, like everyone else in the
Very
village,
weird.
had become quite accustomed to seeing Sumitra in these trances, and so really the friend was not that concerned when she saw Sumitra doing this, but then Sumitra began doing something in her trance that this friend had never seen before. Sumitra, who normally had her hands by her side during these trances, she began raising her hands up till they reached her forehead, and then wildly Sumitra began clawing at something right above her head, and as she did, her breathing became very loud and labored, and so this friend, feeling suddenly so concerned for Sumitra, rushed over, but when she got right next to Sumitra, there was nothing she could do. Sumitra was just clawing at the sky, breathing really heavily, and then suddenly Sumitra stopped and she put her hands down by her side,
This is
and
a
she went
different
back
level
to
of
this
weird.
rigid pose, and then out of Sumitra's mouth came this horrible, low, rattling moan sound. It was just a constant sound that came out of her, and it got deeper and deeper and deeper until Sumitra's voice kind of cracked. And then suddenly Sumitra went totally still. And when this happened, Sumitra's friend, who was right next to her, realized Sumitra, even though she was standing upright, she was not breathing
dead.
at all. It was like she was a
No.
statue. And so this friend began screaming for help. And so Sumitra's in-laws and her husband and other villagers who heard this cry, they came running outside and they quickly circled around Sumitra. And then a few minutes later, the medicine man arrived. He broke through the circle, went right
Yeah,
up
she-
to
she
Sumitra
just
and
died
began
right then,
checking
right?
her out. He checked her pulse, he checked her heartbeat, he kind of looked inside of her mouth, he looked in her eyes, and then after a minute, he stepped back and he just said, "She's dead." Sumitra's husband fell to
That's
his
crazy.
knees, and Sumitra's mother-in-law, who was carrying Sumitra's son, began crying. All the while,
I never heard of someone dying like that in that kind of manner. That's, and where the hell is this story going to go from here? Like, I love when he tells stories like this to just leave me questioning. Like, I have no idea how this is a 32-minute long video when 9 minutes in, this woman is already dead, apparently. Let's see where it goes. I mean, this is one, yeah, I mean, very disturbing. Let's get back to it.
Sumitra's body still remained totally upright and rigid in the middle of all these people, with her hands tight by her side and her eyes rolled back, and her face frozen in what looked like a silent scream. Eventually, the medicine man and Sumitra's father-in-law stepped forward and lowered Sumitra's frozen, rigid body onto the ground on her back, and they closed her eyes. There was no hospital to take Sumitra's body to or official to call about her death. And in this village at this time, it was very important for both religious and public health reasons to take care of the body very quickly. And what that looked like was the villagers would work together to perform the Hindu death rituals, and then afterwards they would cremate the body, which is a process of burning the body until all you have left is the ashes. And so as Sumitra's body lay still rigid on her back right near her home, her family and the villagers began making preparations for her funeral. Sumitra's mother-in-law and some women from the village began scrubbing down Sumitra's body, as well as putting essential oils on her face, and other villagers who were not a
Don't
part
tell
of
me she
that
gets up again.
went off to find wood for a fire. The villagers weren't talking much, and a lot of the women were crying.
She could be clinically dead
but
for a
it
few
wasn't
minutes
just
and
grief
come
they
back,
were feeling.
you know?
It was also fear. They all knew about Sumitra's trances. They happened all the time for months. But what the villagers couldn't wrap their heads around was the idea that during one of these trances, Sumitra had accurately predicted her own death. And so now the villagers couldn't help but think that dark forces were at play here, that maybe Sumitra was possessed, and now whatever had possessed her
Maybe.
and killed killed her is somewhere in the village. And so that night, as the sun started to go down, normally kids would be out playing in the village, but their parents said, no, come inside. It's not safe outside. And so for the most part, the only people who were outside that night were the women who were still cleaning and prepping Sumitra's body for her funeral. And at some point, one of the women who was doing this was brushing out Sumitra's hair. And as she did that, she suddenly stopped and she backed up and screamed and pointed at Sumitra. And then the other women all around Sumitra's body, they looked over at what this person was pointing at, and they too saw it and screamed, and everyone began scrambling to try to get away from Sumitra as fast as possible. What all these terrified women were seeing was that Sumitra, her eyes were closed, but her eyes were darting left and right, so her eyelids were kind of fluttering. And then suddenly Sumitra's chest filled with air, and then she breathed out a long, loud exhale, and then she opened her eyes and she sat bolt upright and began looking around. And the other women who were terrified, they're looking at her and they were struck by how completely healthy and normal Sumitra now looked, even though for the past 45 minutes she didn't have a heartbeat and was totally pale and looked completely dead. Sumitra wiped the essential oils from her face, and then she stood up, and as she did, the medicine man, he had heard all the commotion and ran over, and he ran to Sumitra and kind of assisted her and got her to stand on her feet.
That man had to almost have a heart attack, that medicine man.
And then the medicine man performed a checkup on Sumitra, checking her heartbeat, her pulse. He looked in her mouth, he looked at her eyes, and then he asked Sumitra, how are you feeling? And Sumitra said, I'm okay. And then the medicine man, he kind of turned to face this now huge crowd of onlooking villagers, and the medicine man had a big smile on his face.
There are types of things where, like, I've heard about things where your heartbeat can slow down so much that it appears that you're clinically dead. I don't know to what degree or to what level of accuracy that's true. I've just heard something like that. I'm not an expert in when it comes to these medical things, but I also know about, cases where someone was clinically dead and then came back. I don't know what the longest period of time was, but that could be something like that. But also there very much could be something spiritual at work here. I don't know where this is very strange. And, because it's a very small village, I wonder how much background or how much evidence there is that revolves around this incident. Like he did say at the beginning of the video, there's like a U.S. institution that basically believed this was true, or, we'll find out as this goes on. I know I'm kind of rambling here, but this is just very strange, the manner in which this has happened. Let's continue.
And he said, you all have just witnessed a miracle. Sumitra is back from the dead. Sumitra's husband and her in-laws were too shocked to say anything or really even react. But then suddenly, Sumitra's husband was overcome with joy, and he ran forward to hug Sumitra. But as Sumitra turned and saw him coming towards her, she backed up suddenly and put her hands out to protect herself from her husband. And immediately, the medicine man, he kind of stepped in between the husband and Sumitra, and he patted the husband on the shoulder and said, she's been through something very traumatic. You need to give her time and space to recover. And everybody in the village who saw this happen, they were accustomed to whenever Sumitra fell into one of her trances, when she came out of them, she oftentimes was a little bit confused.
She doesn't remember her husband,
right?
Right?
Assumed that this is what was happening, but on a bigger scale. This is a really intense trance they've seen, but she's just confused. She'll be okay soon. And so the villagers dispersed, and the medicine man assisted Sumitra back into her hut, and he got her in her bed where she fell asleep. And then afterwards, the medicine man reassured Sumitra's husband and her in-laws that Sumitra, when she woke up, she'd likely be just fine, but he would come by and he would do another thorough medical exam on her just to make sure. And the next morning, when Sumitra woke up, she did seem a lot better. When she left her bedroom, she seemed far less confused than she had been the night before. But as soon as Sumitra saw her husband and her in-laws, she got so scared she just bolted from her hut and started running away. And so the medicine man who had just come by to do his thorough checkup, he saw her take off, and so he began chasing her, as well as Sumitra's husband and father-in-law. They took off after Sumitra. And finally, when Sumitra's husband caught up to Sumitra, he grabbed her by the arm to stop her, and Sumitra ripped her arm away from him, and she said, "How dare you touch another man's wife?" And as the husband kind of ushered Sumitra back towards their house,
just gets stranger.
she continued to say, "You're not my family. This is not my home." And then finally, Sumitra's husband and the medicine man had to literally drag Sumitra to get her to go back inside the hut. And as they dragged her inside, she kept screaming that her name was Shiva Dueti and her in-laws had killed her. Over the next couple of days, the medicine man and Sumitra's family tried everything they could to try to snap her out of what seemed like a really long trance.
This, if you look at the title of the video, I maybe had some expectation of where I thought this might go, to a certain degree. Although, MrBallen's stories always surprise you. You never can quite predict where it's going to go. But this went in a very different direction. At first I thought it was something spiritual, but now it seems like it's something possibly still spiritual, but not in the way that I was expecting or thinking. Very interesting. Let's keep going.
But nothing they did worked. It seemed like Sumitra had just kind of lost her mind. Sumitra began refusing to touch her beloved son, and instead would demand that someone bring her Rinku and Tinku. But when no one knew who or what she was talking about, Sumitra would just get furious. Sumitra had never
Couldn't they
gone
show her
to
photos
school
of herself
and so
with her
did
family?
not know
Say,
how to
like,
write.
"This is you."
But now, suddenly, in this new trance that she was in, Sumitra would go inside of her bedroom and write these long, totally unhinged sounding letters to total strangers, asking them to come, please take her home. And when she wasn't doing that, she was typically outside in the courtyard looking at a scar on her foot, wondering how she got it. Sumitra also began wrapping her sari, which is a type of dress fabric, in a new and strange way around her head. She also refused to eat off of any dishes that her family had previously used, and her voice began to sound different. It was higher pitched and much faster, and the way she spoke was always so rude. And so eventually, Sumitra's husband and her in-laws and everybody in the village just kind of resigned themselves to the fact that when Sumitra had not had a heartbeat for 45 minutes when she died, during that
She
time,
got brain damage,
she
thinking.
likely suffered serious brain damage, or at a minimum, when she kind of came back from the dead, she suffered some kind of psychological break. And so that was why she was acting the way she was.
That's possible too.
And soon, people just stopped trying to break Sumitra out of this trance she was in, and instead, they all focused on just trying to keep her from running away or hurting herself. And then one day, on October 20th, 1985, so 3 months after Sumitra had died for 45 minutes, Sumitra's family heard a knock on their front door. When Sumitra's husband went to the door and opened it up, he saw there was this older gentleman standing there wearing a suit and nice shoes, standing several feet back from the door, as if he was kind of shy but felt compelled to knock on the door. Now, right off the bat, this man looked totally out of place to Sumitra's husband. Nobody in this village wore suits or nice shoes. In
Where's the
fact,
story
most
going,
people,
man?
including Sumitra and her family, didn't even wear shoes. But even stranger than what this man was wearing was what he was clutching against his chest. He had this huge leather-bound book with gold trim around the edges that he was holding onto very tightly as if it was very important. And so finally, this strange man, who was visibly nervous and rocking back and forth, began to speak. But his voice was so low, Sumitra's husband had to lean forward just to hear him. The man said his name was Ram Tripathi, and he wanted to know if there was a young woman living in this home who had recently begun acting differently. Sumitra's husband had no idea who Ram Tripathi was. He didn't know this guy. He certainly didn't know where he came from. But what was going through his head was, how is this stranger who's dressed in a funny way, who's got this weird book, how is he aware of the issues my wife is having?
Yeah.
And so after a long pause, Sumitra's husband just kind of looks Ram Tripathi up and down a couple of times and then says, "Wait right here, I'll be right back." And then Sumitra's husband turned around, he walked through the hut into Sumitra's bedroom, and kind of matter-of-factly, he said to Sumitra, who was sitting there writing another letter, that there's a strange man outside named Ram Tripathi, and he's asking about you. Sumitra's husband expected Sumitra to just turn and look at him with a blank stare, like she had been doing the last few days. But this time she turned and looked up at him with a huge smile on her face, and then she leapt up and ran to the front door and leapt into the arms of Ram Tripathi. And Ram Tripathi, he was kind of taken aback, still holding his book, not really reacting to what Sumitra was doing. And at some point, Sumitra leans in and whispers something into Ram Tripathi's ear, and Ram Tripathi, he reacted to it very negatively. He
just doing a number on my head right now.
And looked over at Sumitra's husband like something was wrong, but Sumitra's husband couldn't tell what Sumitra had said, and so the whole situation made no sense to Sumitra's husband, and apparently it also made no sense to Ram Tripathi. And so pretty quickly, Ram Tripathi kind of pushed Sumitra off of him and took a few steps back and looked at Sumitra and said, "What's your name?" And Sumitra is now looking at Ram Tripathi with a look of anger and betrayal on her face, and she says, "My name is Shiva Dwivedi." Ram Tripathi, after hearing this, did not respond, and instead just kind of gestured over to a low wall just outside of their house for he and Sumitra to go sit down on. And so he walked over, and Sumitra followed him, they sat down, and Sumitra's husband, he walked over, but he stayed a couple of feet back standing up. And once Ram Tripathi was sitting down, he lowered his big leather-bound book and he opened it up, and inside were all these photographs. And right away, Ram Tripathi pointed at one of the pictures, which contained a bunch of people in it, and he turned to Sumitra and he said, "Can you identify who's in this
I know I'm kind of
photo?"
quiet on
And
this one.
Sumitra, she looked at
trying
the
to pay
photo
attention.
and immediately began rattling off names
so odd.
that were all correct. These are people that Sumitra's husband, he's looked over, and he's got no idea who the people are in that photo. And so after Sumitra correctly identifies that photo, Ram Tripathi turns the page, he picks out another photo, and he says, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And again, Sumitra, one by one, would name correctly all the people in the photo. And then finally, Ram Tripathi took a sigh, and he flipped the page one more time, and he pointed to one particular picture which contained one person. And he looked at Sumitra and he said, "Do you know who this is?" And Sumitra, she would look over at the photo, and instead of immediately saying the name, she paused, and she kind of began to breathe heavy, and she seemed kind of angry, and then she looked at Ram Tripathi and she said, "I know who that is. That's my sister-in-law, and she killed me by hitting me over the head with a brick." And at this, Ram Tripathi...
Oh, shit. I'm thinking, what was the first woman's name? This Shiva Dwivedi is this new person's name, but what was the other other woman's name? Sorry, I think it was her name. I forgot the exact name, but the woman as she was before she died, when she was having those fits, right? She was like clutching her head. She was saying she was feeling a pain in her head, like clawing like something above her head, and like this woman, this sister-in-law, apparently hit this other woman and killed her by hitting her in the head with a brick. That's crazy. That's insane. Like, can you imagine if this really is like the spirit of this other woman that was killed that's in this other body? Like, when I say I believe in like spiritual possession, I didn't mean like the spirits of people. I don't not believe that human spirits are a thing. I just have personally never had direct encounters or experiences with that. I've had experiences with what I would call inhuman spirits, which is something else entirely. But this is just like an example of what is supposedly reincarnation. Like, this is getting weirder and weirder, man. Like, I don't know how to feel about this, because I haven't really ever well researched the concept of reincarnation, and I don't know how I feel about it. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I'll get to more of them after the reaction itself. Let's continue.
Tripathi dropped his book on the ground, and he turned and embraced Sumitra as hard and as intensely as she had when she had run out and leapt into his arms. And he and Sumitra, they hugged and cried for a long time. And then finally, when they separated, Ram Tripathi turned to Sumitra's husband, who's still just standing there totally bewildered, and he tells him, "Let's go inside and I'll explain everything." Once Ram Tripathi was inside with Sumitra and her family, he told them an unbelievable story about a woman named Shiva Dwivedi. Shiva Dwivedi was, of course, the name that Sumitra for months had been saying was her own. But over those few months, her family had just assumed that that name meant nothing and that what she was saying was nonsense because of her brain injury. But Ram Tripathi would tell them that Shiva Dwivedi was the name of a young woman who lived in a city none of them had ever heard before, located about 60 miles away from their village. He would tell them that Shiva was a very wealthy woman who was college educated, and she had 2 young sons. And it would turn out that Shiva's youngest child was born almost on the same day that Sumitra's child was born in December of 1984. But unlike Sumitra, who after the birth of her child felt like her life got so much better, she loved her family, she was excited about the future, for Shiva, it was the opposite. When her first child arrived, it was like her life got worse and worse and worse.
You know, there are certain things out there that people can't explain that could have a spiritual factor play a role. Like, for example, the idea that a twin can feel when another twin is in danger or when they're in pain. Or that twins can, like, finish one another's thought. Or just have, like, this special, like, you know, extra physical, maybe that's not the right word, metaphysical, I would say, sort of like relationship, like this weird synchronicity of the minds. You know, could this happen with other people who don't know each other, who are just born at the exact same time, who are just victims of circumstance, of like a weird, I don't know, I wish I could better elucidate what I'm trying to say here, but I feel like there's a lot of compelling mystery to this, and I don't know what to think about it yet. Let's keep going.
Shiva's in-laws had grown to hate her. They didn't like that she was so well educated, and they hated the family she came from. And so by early 1985, when by this point Sumitra was regularly falling into those trances with her eyes rolling back and her teeth gnashing, the tension and fighting in Shiva's home, 60 miles away, was
Shiva
reaching
woman was
an
killed,
almost
too.
unbearable level.
The trances.
Shiva began writing these long letters that she would send to her family far away, where she would detail waking up almost every night with nightmares, screaming. And in May of 1985, which is when Sumitra began speaking during her trances, Shiva got into the biggest fight she had ever gotten into with her in-laws about attending a family wedding. And on the night of May 18th, 1985, Shiva's neighbors in her city saw Shiva's in-laws literally carrying Shiva's body, which appeared to be unconscious, as they walked along the railroad tracks. When these neighbors ran up and asked if everything was okay with Shiva, Shiva's in-laws just said, oh, you know, she's sick and we're taking her to the hospital. Now, it was nighttime, there were no lights around, and so it was really dark, and these neighbors couldn't get a good look at Shiva to see, you know, what was going on with her. And so even though they thought this was very strange, they decided not to say anything. The next morning, Shiva's dead body was found lying on the train tracks right near the train station. And so someone raised the alarm, and before long, Shiva's uncle and sister ran to the train station, and when they got there and saw Shiva on the tracks, they also saw Shiva's in-laws were already there. And when they spoke to Shiva's in-laws, they told the uncle and the sister that it looks like Shiva must have jumped in front of a train to commit suicide. But the uncle and sister are looking down at Shiva's body, and there appeared to be really no markings, bruises, cuts of any kind on her body that you would expect from getting hit by a train, except Shiva did have a very big mark on her head. Later on, the uncle and sister would say it looked like something had bashed Shiva's head in. Shiva's in-laws would immediately cremate Shiva's body before Shiva's actual family could stop them, and the police in this area were not good at investigating crime. So
be
when
very
Shiva's
careful you
in-laws
surround
went
yourself
to them
with.
and
Seriously,
said, yep, she jumped in
so
front
many
of a
sick
train,
people
she
out there.
committed suicide, but we don't have a body because we already cremated her, the police just accepted it. Shiva's father was convinced that Shiva had been murdered, but he didn't have a way to prove it. Until Sumitra appeared to die on July 19th, 1985, and then came back to life, claiming to be Shiva. Shiva's father had heard a rumor about some girl in a village 60 miles away claiming to be his dead daughter. Now, at first, Shiva's father did not believe this, but eventually he decided he would go to the village and test this girl to see if maybe it was true. And so, on October 20th, 1985, Shiva's father put on his best suit and his nicest shoes, he brought his leather-bound photo book, and he headed to Sumitra's village and knocked on her hut. Ram Tripathi was Shiva's dad. When Sumitra at first ran outside and leapt onto Ram Tripathi and hugged him, and then whispered something into his ear that Sumitra's husband saw happening but couldn't hear what she said, and then Ram Tripathi, when he heard what she whispered, he kind of recoiled and acted angry for a second. what Sumitra was saying was Papa. In the moment, Ram Tripathi, who was not convinced Sumitra was his daughter, felt like this is a horrible, elaborate hoax and it needs to stop. But then Sumitra correctly identified 15 people in his leather-bound photo album, including the sister-in-law who she said killed her. And even more convincing than that was that Sumitra knew how Shiva had been killed, by getting smashed over the head with a brick. This was a question that Ram Tripathi had never heard the answer to before. And at that point, Ram Tripathi believed that this must be his daughter's reincarnated spirit inside of Sumitra.
I'm trying to just figure out how, if at all, I'm not trying to accuse here, but if this woman were to somehow fake this, if this was some kind of hoax, how it could be achieved. There has to be some logical answer to this, and that logical answer could either be physical or it could be spiritual. But if it is physical, if it is some kind of hoax, this village probably didn't have access to that kind of information. So it still raises a serious question as to how she would have pulled this off. If this was an elaborate scheme of some kind. We have to consider the fact that this other family has more money, right? And she was, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting the name of the first woman before she was reincarnated. Sumitra, that's, you have to consider the fact that Sumitra was unhappy with her life in this village. And so would she have looked enviously upon some other life with a more wealthy family? So is there some kind of intent behind this? Was this purposeful? And was this again, a hoax that just kind of fooled this older man, and he was a spiritual man, he had a spiritual belief in reincarnation, so he was just kind of swindled. Is that possible? I think it is possible. Is it probable? That's the better question. Because this could just as easily be a genuine spiritual occurrence. I don't know. I don't know what to think. Let's finish this one up, though.
And so that was when he dropped the book and gave her a big hug. This story is considered to be one of the most credible reincarnation stories ever recorded. Scientists from the University of Virginia in America actually went to India to study Sumitra and interview everybody involved. And they concluded that this was not a hoax. They said that Sumitra had most likely either been possessed by or reincarnated as Shiva Duety. The change in Sumitra's voice that her family noticed was the same accent that Shiva had. It was very urban and educated. The strange new way that Sumitra wrapped her sari on her head was the same way that Shiva did. Sumitra was rude to her family and refused to eat off the same dishes as them because she believed she was actually a very wealthy woman who was for some reason being forced to live in this poor person's hut. And when Sumitra asked for Tinku and Rinku, those were nicknames that Shiva had given her two sons. And all those seemingly unhinged letters that Sumitra had written and fired off to random strangers were in fact sent to various members of Shiva's family. After Shiva's father, Ram Tripathi, brought Sumitra's story to the police would actually investigate this case, and they would charge some members of Shiva's family. But ultimately, Sumitra's testimony was deemed unacceptable for court, and so the case was never officially solved. As for Shiva's in-laws, they have always denied killing her. Sumitra lived the entire rest of her life as Shiva, and Shiva's real parents accepted her as their daughter.
Wow.
Sumitra also came to accept her son and raised her son with her husband in their little village until she died in 1998.
Wow.
So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to read the like button a bedtime story, but badly mispronounce every fourth word.
Okay. That was probably one of the most interesting stories. I mean, it's a high bar, right? Because it's a long and storied history on this channel of MrBallen doing very interesting stories. But this one in particular just had me constantly questioning and constantly trying to guess what was going on, and kind of just had me spinning around in circles mentally, trying to follow this story because it was just so weird. I mean, the skeptic part of me wants to say that maybe this was an elaborate and successful hoax, and, people who didn't have a formal education, people who had deeply spiritual beliefs, were just fooled by this woman who was unhappy with her village life, living in a hut, living in poverty, and envied the life of this family. And somehow she had heard that this other woman had died, and so she kind of saw an opportunity to hatch a scheme. That's totally possible. Look, just because someone doesn't have a formal education doesn't mean they can't be clever. And that's something very important to keep in mind. And another thing to consider was that these researchers, they weren't there to corroborate the events as they played out. And they were only able to document based on the assumption that what they were told was the unmitigated truth. But in fact, there was a lack of demonstrable objectivity here. Like, the supposed experience of these people might have been informed and even compromised by their particular religious beliefs, or even a moment of shared hysteria. There's the concept of folie à deux, a madness shared by two, but sometimes the madness is shared by much more than that, many more people. Also, you had the girl's family who might have been in on it, and you also had the more well-off family from another village who might have been duped or also in on it somehow, although I don't know how that would be possible. But what you didn't have was an unbiased third party to document the events as they occurred in real time. And that's the part within me, after hearing this story, that remains the most skeptical. At the same time, I do counterbalance that with an open mind. And I absolutely believe that things like possession happen. I could go into personal stories, but most people will not believe these stories anyway, so, I just kind of keep it in here. I kind of keep it in here and up here. Some things are just... And also some things I'm just not ready to share either. It's partly that. But I do believe in that kind of stuff. Again, I don't know how I feel about reincarnation. I've never really explored the subject fully. And it's interesting because I was just talking with a friend about this, who believes in reincarnation, a couple weeks ago. We were shooting messages back and forth, and this person was discussing the concept and explaining why they think it's possible. And I was leaning more on the side of, well, it's interesting. It's certainly something to think about, but I don't have a great wealth of information. Basically I said, I don't necessarily disbelieve in it, but I'm not going to just immediately believe in it without having some background and a little bit of education and being informed on everything that is entailed within the subject of reincarnation. So that's kind of where I fall on that particular thing. But this one, this one could go either way. I'm going to go 60-40. 60% chance that this is a hoax, or just, again, a shared hallucination. People who were just confused and very scared and didn't fully understand what was happening. And 40%, maybe this was really spiritual. Maybe this really was true, and this was a genuine case of reincarnation. It's certainly very strange the way it happened. Why would this Sumitra woman have these seizures, and why would she kind of predict the death of this other woman who was 60, 70 miles away in some other city before the death actually happened? That's the part that kind of tugs at the skepticism a little bit and says, hey, wait, you might be skeptical. You might be thinking that this could be an elaborate scheme of some kind, but this particular factor, how do you explain that, even if she did do this purposefully, how could she have known that this woman would die weeks later when these seizures began? Because these seizures for the Sumitra woman, they started before that Shiva woman actually was killed. So that's the thing that I can't explain. That's the kind of wrench that's thrown in there that makes me think, well, maybe this was something spiritual. But it's very, like I said, when I put it together, when she was clawing above her head while she was having those seizures, and then to hear how this woman died, that was the most chilling part of the story. That was the most disturbing element in this story. And again, the one little thing that makes me want to believe that this was something more, that this is more than just something as mundane as someone pulling a hoax, that there is something deeper here. So I don't know. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. But either way, I thought this was a very compelling and compellingly told story, as usual. He's a great storyteller. He has great content, as usual. And I can't wait to check out more. So let's start a conversation in the comments. Let me know what your beliefs are. Let me know what you thought of this story, and if you agree or disagree with my conclusion. So that's it for this one. Looking forward to reacting to more from this guy, definitely. So you'll probably see that sooner rather than later. In the meantime, more content in general is on the way. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out my Patreon. Check out my socials, link down below. Much love to the nuclear family, and I will catch you all very soon.